that I will never again teach about Nebraska Man and Piltdown Man. Those are permanently out of my lecture notes for all time. Thank you. Right, and yes, I did note Java Man, which of course was simply a in the original find it was a skull cap and a leg bone found a long distance away. I do hope you will allow me to mention the Sangheran II skull, which turned up I don't remember the exact date. I believe it was in the 1980s, which is basically a skull with most of the face still present. I can drop Lucy if you really think I should, but a fossil found in a cave in South Africa called Sterkfontein, known as Littlefoot, has recently turned up, which they are still getting out of the ground, but it appears to be a complete Australopithecine. If you'll let me teach about that, I suppose that's fair. Neanderthals are old men with arthritis. Yes, of course, the first complete Neanderthal skull found at a place in France called La Chapelle-aux-Saints was definitely an old man who was stooped with arthritis. The baby Neanderthal skeletons that have turned up at a few locations in Europe probably weren't, but I won't teach about those if you'd rather I not. I certainly don't want to upset anybody. Oh, incidentally, this is a reconstruction of the skull of Peking Man, and you did mention that all evidence had disappeared, so I guess I won't teach about Peking Man, except the location was reopened in the 1970s. More bones have been found, and very similar bones to this have turned up elsewhere. So if Arkansas law does not allow me to teach Peking Man, maybe it will allow me to teach about Yunshai Man, for instance, which is a substantially complete skull. So thank you for giving such an excellent answer to my question. What I believe we're supposed to talk about now is age of the Earth, and it is obviously between 6,000 and 10,000 years. That's what's printed in Standard Commentary on the King James. 6,000 plus a little bit was the age arrived at by an Irish archbishop, Archbishop Usher of Armagh, doing the calculations back in the 1500s. And I really don't want even to attempt to defend the idea that the Earth could possibly be old. What I do have, again, is another question that's been troubling me a great deal, that comes from time that I've spent going out into the Mojave Desert of southern Nevada and southeastern California. Yes, the largest city in the Mojave Desert is Las Vegas. But there's nothing wrong with Las Vegas that couldn't be cured with a nice little fire and brimstone shower, if you ask me. Everything you've heard is true, but the surrounding regions are quite nice. And this right here is Owens Lake, California, just outside the small town of Independence, as seen from that's probably the Inyo Mountains in the foreground with the Sierra Nevada in the background. By the way, the Inyo Mountains have a very steep slope that's nearly vertical, that's affectionately known as the Inyo Face. Thanks. It was a sympathy laugh, but I appreciate it anyhow. Right. Owens Lake used to be a lake. There used to be water in it. There used to be steamboat service across the lake, freighting silver that was coming from the mines up in the mountains down to the nearest town of Independence, California. Owens Lake, unfortunately, dried up in the early 1900s. Los Angeles, the city, bought the rights to all of the streams and the springs that flowed into Owens Lake and kept it moist. Those have all been diverted into an aqueduct. And Owens Lake is now Owens Dry Lake, and it's visible as that white patch off in the distance. There is no more water except for a few days after the occasional rainstorm. What it's left behind is bad news for asthma sufferers, because the dry dust on the floor of the lake is now free to blow, and generally makes life rather miserable when a windstorm comes through, as they often do out there. But most of the surface of the lake is made up of salt. When you get a lake that is cut off from flowing out to another source, be it another lake or the ocean, when that happens, there's nowhere for the water to go but through evaporation, leaving salt behind. So a lake that cannot flow out will become increasingly salty, as we've seen happen in the Dead Sea, for example, which has no outlet to the ocean. If you were to drive maybe 75, 100 miles, you would come to a location called Badwater, which happens to be 279 feet below sea level. So I can say that visiting there was definitely the low point of my career. It's the lowest spot in the Western Hemisphere. And it's what's left of another dried-up desert lake. And we know this because, it was dry when Europeans came through, but if memory serves, there have been some Native American artifacts that have been found on the shores that include things like fish hooks and fish traps and things of that sort. So we know that there were people there at a time when Badwater was still an isolated lake. And it apparently has grown extremely salty, saltier and saltier. The water has left, and we end up with a flat valley that is completely crusted with salt. That looks like snow. It isn't. And if you dig down, you get tens of feet of solid salt. This is not a very, very pleasant place to visit on hot days, because the temperature has a way of going over 130 Fahrenheit. You know how they say it's not the heat, it's the humidity? Folks, when it's 130 degrees, you don't care whether it's the humidity or not. And you'll find lots of other salt lakes out in the desert. They're known by the Spanish word playas. This is another one in Death Valley called the Racetrack. And they're formed by isolated lakes drying up. And sometimes we're there to see it, sometimes we're not. But there have been instances where lakes have dried up in historical times. So we can observe the process that gives rise to a thick bed of salt. Would I be allowed to teach this? Okay, I'm good. In the 1970s, a researcher by the name of Kenneth Shue and his team started drilling in the rocks that lie beneath the Mediterranean Sea. The Mediterranean is, of course, between Europe on the north and Asia on the south side, and the Holy Land and its eastern border, And drilling in these rocks showed the existence of massive layers of salt. You penetrate down into the rocks that make up the bottom, you go down a little ways, and you start hitting very thick layers of salt. And you find other minerals that, as far as I am aware, can only be produced by evaporation. Calcium sulfate is one, better known as gypsum, perhaps better known as plaster of Paris. A sulfur-containing mineral called anhydrite is also found in the Mediterranean Sea. There's a very good article on this in Scientific American for the year 1972. And minerals like this have only been observed, as far as I know, forming during the evaporation of water that is rich in minerals. Anhydrite, in particular, this calcium sulfate form, only forms in water that is evaporating, that's hotter than 95 degrees Fahrenheit. So the water has to be just a bit less than body temperature for this mineral to form at all. And it has been observed forming in desert lakes, in lakes called sabkhas, which are found in the Sahara and found in Saudi Arabia and found in other parts of the world as well. If the entire Mediterranean Sea were to dry up right now, the estimate that I've got is for every 1,000 feet of water depth should leave a layer of about 15 feet of salt if you're evaporating from salty water. If the entire sea were to dry up right now, it would leave a layer of salts a few hundred feet thick, and based on what we know on the physics of how evaporation works, it would take roughly 1,000 years to dry up completely. It would not dry up overnight. What Dr. Schuss found, who led the team that did the drilling, found that the salt and evaporite layers in the rocks below the Mediterranean Sea were many thousands of feet thick. His interpretation, and of course he is an evil secular humanist, so you should take this with a grain of salt. Oh, did I just say that? I'm sorry, that was unintentional. His interpretation was that the Mediterranean Sea has dried up repeatedly and been refilled. Even if you were to dry up all of the sea once and for all, it wouldn't leave layers of salt and gypsum and anhydrite thousands of feet thick. And his team and others have mapped the Mediterranean Sea floor. The black areas right there are areas where table salt, the salt that you are familiar with in your salt shakers, have been found. Other minerals that are, as far as we know, formed only in evaporation, like gypsum and anhydrite, are found in other regions. And you'll notice that they extend all the way over, sorry, if the volume keeps going up and down, all the way over to the coast of ancient Phoenicia and Judea, modern-day Israel. If you take a boring instrument, me being a boring professor, I have plenty of those, and drill down into the base of the Mediterranean Sea using essentially the same technology that's used in offshore drilling rigs, you can pull out a circular cross-section of the layers of rock that you find once you get below the water level. This is known as taking a core sample. It's a very standard procedure. And at two different places, this is what you find. You find layers of sandstone, you find layers of a rock called diatomite, which I'll talk about in a moment, and you find several layers, 4 in the case of Greece, 5 in the case of Sicily, of salt separated by other types of rock. The problem is this: there are staggering numbers of fossils that are mixed in with these beds. Now, I am quite aware that fossils cannot ever provide any evidence whatsoever for evolution. The only thing a fossil can ever show you is that something died, right? All right, that's what you taught me last time. There are huge numbers of fossils of extinct life forms, things that we don't see now, that are mixed in with the salt beds. Some of these fossils are large, they are shells, mollusks, things like that. Others of them are microscopic in size. You're not likely to have heard of them, but people who do things like oil exploration will know of these forms called foraminifera and ostracoda and things like that. Now, we have huge numbers of fossils of things that we haven't found living today mixed in with these extremely thick salt beds, below them and above them. One of Dr. Hovind's excellent online essays states that bent rock layers, fossil graveyards, and polystrata fossils are best explained by a flood. I'd rather not talk about polystrata fossils and bent rock layers just yet, although there are some very nice bent rock layers in the road cut of Interstate 430, which is what I took to get here. But if fossil beds, rich in fossils of things that we no longer see alive, formed in the Great Flood, this must somehow mean that the salt beds did not form by evaporation. They must have formed in a flood. They must have formed